The iron cage sat in the middle of Dustfield's main street, like a monument to cruelty. Inside, a girl no older than 18 stood with her back pressed against the rusted bars, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. The sign hanging from the cage read in bold letters, "Property of Cornelius Vane. Debt unpaid." Silas Thorne had seen plenty of injustice in his 45 years, but this made his stomach turn. He pulled his horse to a stop outside Macready's saloon, his weathered hands gripping the reins so tight his knuckles went white. The girl inside that cage reminded him of someone he'd tried to forget for 20 years. A crowd had gathered around the spectacle, some pointing and laughing, others shaking their heads in disgust, but nobody was doing anything about it. That was Dustfield for you, a town where decent folks turned blind eyes when it suited them. Silas dismounted and pushed through the crowd, his boots kicking up dust with each determined step. As he got closer, he could hear the girl whimpering. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and her blonde hair hung in tangled strands around her face. She couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds, soaking wet. "What's this about?" Silas called out to no one in particular. An old-timer with tobacco stains on his beard spat into the dirt. "Mercy Whitlock owes Vane $200. Her daddy borrowed it before he died, left her with the debt. Vane says if she can't pay by sundown, she stays in that cage until someone buys her contract." Silas felt his jaw clench. $200 might as well have been $2,000 for a girl like her. It was more than most folks in Dustfield saw in 2 years, but Silas knew exactly what Vane's contract meant. He'd heard the stories about girls who disappeared into his network of brothels and gambling dens scattered across 3 territories. The girl's eyes met his through the bars, and for a moment, time stopped. Those weren't just any eyes. They were his daughter's eyes, the daughter he'd never held, never known, because he'd been too proud to marry her mother when she was carrying his child. The daughter who died of fever at age 3 while he was off chasing cattle thieves and his own guilt. "Please," Mercy whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmuring crowd. "Please, mister, I ain't done nothing wrong." Silas reached into his vest pocket and felt the worn leather of his billfold. Inside was exactly $203, every cent he had left in the world after his last cattle sale. It was supposed to buy seed for next season's crop, supplies to get through winter, maybe fix the roof on his cabin before the rains came. But standing there, looking at this girl, who could have been his own flesh and blood, Silas realized something that hit him like a mule kick to the chest. Some debts weren't about money at all. Heavy footsteps approached from behind, and Silas turned to see Cornelius Vane himself, strutting toward the cage like a peacock in a 3-piece suit. The man's gold teeth glinted in the afternoon sun as he smiled at his captive audience. "Well, well," Vane announced, his voice carrying across the street. "Looks like our little dove has attracted quite the crowd. Any gentleman care to make an offer before I transport her to more profitable ventures?" That's when Silas made a decision that would change everything. But what he didn't know was that Cornelius Vane had been watching him too, and the cruel smile spreading across the loan shark's face suggested this was about to become much more complicated than a simple transaction. Silas stepped forward, his hand still resting on his billfold. Every instinct told him to walk away, mind his own business, preserve what little he had left. But those eyes, those damn eyes that looked just like his daughter's, wouldn't let him turn his back. "I'll pay her debt," Silas announced, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur like a blade. The laughter died instantly. Cornelius Vane's smile widened, showing more of those gold teeth. "Well, now, Silas Thorne, isn't it? The hermit from the North Ridge. I didn't figure you for the charitable type." Silas ignored the jab and pulled out his billfold, counting the bills with deliberate slowness. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. Mercy's hands clutched the bars tighter, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since he'd arrived. $200, Silas said, holding up the money. "That clears her debt." Vane circled the cage like a predator, his expensive boots clicking against the hard-packed earth. "Oh, but you see, there's been an addition to the terms. Interest, you understand, compounding daily. The debt now stands at $250. The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He watched Mercy's face crumble as hope died in her eyes. $50 more than he had in the world. $50 that might as well have been $500. That wasn't the original agreement, protested the old-timer who'd explained the situation. You said $200 at sundown. Vane shrugged, straightening his silk tie. Business terms change. Market fluctuations. The girl's getting older by the hour, which affects her value. Silas felt rage building in his chest. The kind of anger that had gotten him into trouble before. He thought about his empty cabin, his failing ranch, the long winter ahead. He thought about his daughter, cold in the ground these 20 years. He thought about the promises he'd never kept and the words he'd never spoken. I'll work off the extra 50, Silas heard himself say. Whatever you need done. The crowd stirred uneasily. Everyone knew what kind of work Cornelius Vane required from desperate men. Debt collection, intimidation, sometimes worse. Vane's eyes lit up with genuine interest. Now that's fascinating. Silas Thorne, offering to work for me. You know what they say about you, don't you? They say you killed 3 men in Abilene. They say you've got fast hands and a slow conscience. Silas didn't deny it, couldn't deny it. Those ghosts had been following him for 15 years, whispering in his ear during the long, lonely nights on his ranch. Do we have a deal or not? Silas growled. Vane walked over to the cage and ran a finger along the bars, making Mercy flinch away from his touch. Here's what I'm thinking. You want this girl? You can have her. All debts cleared, but you work for me for 1 month, starting with a little collection job I've got lined up for tomorrow. The trap was closing, and Silas could feel it. Whatever job Vane had in mind, it wouldn't be collecting overdue loans from shopkeepers. It would be the kind of work that left blood on his hands and more weight on his conscience. But Mercy was looking at him again, those eyes pleading silently, the same eyes his daughter would have had if she'd lived to 18, if he'd been man enough to claim her when it mattered. 1 month, Silas agreed, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. Vane produced a key from his vest pocket and unlocked the cage with theatrical flourish. Welcome to freedom, my dear, and welcome to my employment, Mr. Thorne. I do believe this arrangement is going to be very interesting indeed. As Mercy stumbled out of the cage on unsteady legs, Silas caught her arm to keep her from falling. She looked up at him with gratitude and confusion, not understanding the price he'd just agreed to pay. But across the street, 3 men in black hats had been watching the entire exchange. And when Vane nodded in their direction, Silas realized his troubles were just beginning. Mercy's legs buckled the moment she stepped out of the cage, and Silas had to catch her full weight to keep her from hitting the ground. She felt like nothing in his arms, all bones and terror. Up close, he could see the purple bruises on her wrist where the iron bars had cut into her skin. Easy there, he murmured, steadying her against his chest. You're safe now. But even as he said the words, Silas knew they were a lie. Nobody was safe in Cornelius Vane's orbit. The man didn't make deals. He set traps. And Silas had just walked into the biggest one of his life. Vane clapped his hands together like he was dismissing a theater performance. Touching reunion aside, we have business to discuss, Mr. Thorne. The girl needs somewhere to stay, and you need to understand your new obligation. The crowd was beginning to disperse, disappointed that the show was over. But those 3 men in black hats remained, leaning against the hitching post outside the sheriff's office. Silas recognized the type, hired guns with dead eyes and quick hands, the kind of men who worked for people like Vane when regular intimidation wasn't enough. She comes with me, Silas said, helping Mercy find her footing. That's part of the deal. Vane's laugh was like broken glass. Oh, my dear fellow, you misunderstand. The girl is free to go wherever she pleases. But you belong to me now, for the next 30 days. Mercy looked between them, confusion replacing the relief in her eyes. What's he talking about? What did you agree to? Before Silas could answer, Vane pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. Even from a distance, Silas could see it was a contract, complete with legal seals and witness signatures. The man had come prepared for this exact scenario. Your savior here has agreed to perform certain services for me, Vane explained, his tone mockingly gentle. Collection work, mostly. Sometimes people owe me money and need encouragement to pay. Sometimes they need to be taught respect for lawful contracts. The blood drained from Mercy's face. You mean he has to hurt people? Because of me? Silas felt something twist in his gut. The girl wasn't just grateful, she was horrified. She understood exactly what price he'd paid for her freedom, and it was eating her alive. The first job is tomorrow morning, Vane continued, consulting a gold pocket watch. Widow Patterson has been late on her payments. 3 months late. Her farm would fetch a nice price if she were motivated to sell. Silas knew Martha Patterson. She was 70 years old and trying to work 40 acres by herself since her husband died of consumption. She probably owed Vane money for medicine or funeral costs. The thought of intimidating her made him sick. But then he looked at Mercy again, seeing how she clutched her torn dress closed at the shoulder, how she favored her left foot, where the cage had cut circulation. This girl had been through hell, and he was the only thing standing between her and worse. Where do I find her? Silas asked quietly. Vane smiled like a cat with a cornered mouse. Oh, you know where she lives. Little white farmhouse on Creek Road. But here's the interesting part. She's not alone anymore. Her grandson arrived from Denver yesterday. Big fellow, I'm told. Used to be a lawman. That's when Silas realized this wasn't just about collecting a debt. Vane was testing him, seeing how far he'd go, how much blood he was willing to spill. And if Silas refused or failed, he had a feeling that Iron Cage would be the least of Mercy's worries. The ride to Silas's ranch felt like the longest 3 miles of his life. Mercy sat behind him on his horse, her arms wrapped around his waist, trembling from exhaustion and shock. Every few minutes, he felt her shoulders shake with silent tears. "Why did you do it?" she finally whispered, as they crested the hill overlooking his property. "You don't even know me." Silas didn't answer right away. How could he explain about the daughter he'd never claimed? About 20 years of regret that felt like carrying stones in his chest? About how her eyes had reached into his soul and grabbed hold of something he thought was dead? Sometimes a man's got to do what's right, he said instead, even when it's stupid. The ranch house came into view, a simple wooden structure with a sagging porch and patched roof. It wasn't much, but it was honest work that had built it. Work that was about to be tainted by whatever Vane had planned for him. As they approached the house, Mercy gasped. "Look there! Someone's been here!" Silas's blood ran cold. The front door hung open, and his few possessions were scattered across the porch. Chairs overturned, his rifle missing from above the mantel. The 3 men in black hats had moved fast. "Stay on the horse," Silas ordered, sliding down from the saddle. He drew his sidearm and approached the house cautiously, every nerve on edge. Inside, the destruction was methodical. His mattress had been slashed open, feathers scattered like snow across the floor. His food stores were dumped out, dishes smashed. But this wasn't random vandalism. They were searching for something. "Looking for this?" a voice called from behind him. Silas spun around to find one of Vane's men standing in the doorway, holding a small wooden box. The man was tall and lean, with a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. He wore his gun low on his hip, like he knew how to use it. "Name's Carson," the man said casually, as if they were discussing the weather. "Mr. Vane sent me to deliver a message. Seems he forgot to mention one little detail about your arrangement." Silas kept his gun trained on Carson but didn't fire. Not with Mercy so close outside. "What detail?" Carson opened the wooden box and pulled out a faded photograph, the only picture Silas owned of his daughter's mother. Elena Vasquez, barely 16 when it was taken, holding a baby that would die before her first birthday. "Funny thing about working for Mr. Vane," Carson continued, studying the photograph with mock interest. "He likes to know everything about his employees, their histories, their regrets, their weaknesses." The implication hit Silas like a physical blow. Vane knew about Elena, knew about the daughter, knew exactly which strings to pull to make him dance. "That girl out there," Carson nodded toward the door, "she reminds you of someone, doesn't she? Someone you failed to protect once before." Silas's finger tightened on the trigger. "Get to the point." "The point is insurance," Carson said, carefully placing the photograph back in the box. "You do the job tomorrow, and do it right, or Mr. Vane starts asking questions around town. Questions about why a man like you lives alone, Questions about what happened to that Mexican girl who used to clean house for the preacher. Questions about the baby that died so convenient-like. The room tilted around Silas. Elena hadn't just died of fever. She'd been murdered. Poisoned by the preacher's wife who couldn't stand having a Mexican woman in her house, especially one carrying a bastard child. Silas had suspected but never been able to prove it. Never had the courage to seek justice. 20 years is a long time, Carson continued, but murder has no statute of limitation, especially when there's an eyewitness willing to come forward. Silas felt the walls closing in around him. Vane didn't just want him as hired muscle, he wanted him as a slave. Someone so compromised he could never refuse an order, never walk away. If you were Silas, what would you do? Carson asked with genuine curiosity. Protect the girl outside who reminds you of your dead daughter? Or protect your own neck from a hangman's noose? Because tomorrow morning when you knock on Martha Patterson's door, you're going to have to choose. Outside, Mercy called his name nervously. Carson smiled and tipped his hat. Better make the right choice, Thorne. Mr. Vane doesn't believe in second chances. As Carson walked away, Silas realized the trap was even deeper than he'd imagined. And somewhere in Dustfield, a 70-year-old widow was about to become the test of everything he claimed to believe in. That night, Silas sat on his porch, watching Mercy sleep in his bed through the open doorway. She'd insisted on cleaning up the mess Carson's men had made, working in determined silence until exhaustion finally claimed her. Now, she curled up like a wounded animal, one hand clutched around the quilt his mother had sewn 40 years ago. The wooden box sat heavy in his lap. Inside, Elena's photograph stared up at him with eyes full of trust he'd betrayed. Their daughter, Isabella, had inherited those same dark eyes before fever took her at 3 years old. Or so everyone believed. Silas knew different now. The preacher's wife, Agnes Holbrook, had poisoned them both. A little arsenic in the milk, a little more in the medicine, all because she couldn't stand a Mexican woman living in her perfect Christian household. Agnes was still alive, still sitting in the front pew every Sunday, still collecting sympathy for her charitable work with unfortunate. Tomorrow morning, he had two choices. He could ride to Martha Patterson's farm and intimidate a 70-year-old widow into giving up her land, or he could refuse and watch Vane destroy what little reputation he had left while Mercy paid the price for his rebellion. "You're awake." Mercy's soft voice came from the doorway. She stood there in his oversized shirt, her blonde hair falling loose around her shoulders. "Can't sleep either?" Silas closed the box and set it aside. "Just thinking." She walked onto the porch and sat beside him on the wooden step, careful to keep some distance between them. "About tomorrow?" "About a lot of things." Mercy was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the stars scattered across the Texas sky. "My daddy used to sit like this before he died, just looking at nothing, carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders." "What was he like?" Silas asked, surprised by his own curiosity. "Good man." "Weak man." Her voice carried no judgment, just sadness. "He borrowed that money from Vane to pay for my mama's medicine when she got the lung sickness. She died anyway, and Daddy started drinking, started gambling, started making promises he couldn't keep." Silas felt a familiar ache in his chest. "Men do stupid things when they're grieving. Is that what you're doing now? Something stupid because of grief?" The question hit closer to home than he wanted to admit. "Maybe." Mercy turned to face him fully, and in the moonlight, she looked older than her 18 years. "That man today, Carson, he said something about you failing to protect someone before. Was it true?" Silas found himself telling her about Elena, about Isabella, about 20 years of carrying guilt like broken glass in his chest. He told her about the preacher's wife, and the poison, and the justice that never came. He told her things he'd never spoken aloud to another living soul. When he finished, Mercy was crying again. But these weren't tears of fear or despair. These were tears of understanding. "You think saving me will somehow save them," she said quietly. "Maybe. And you think letting Vane use you will somehow balance the scales. I don't know what I think anymore." Mercy reached over and took his hand, her fingers small and warm against his calloused palm. "My daddy thought the same thing, that he could work his way out of debt to Vane, that he could protect me by playing along with that man's games. What happened to him? He put his gun in his mouth on a Tuesday morning when he realized the debt only got bigger, never smaller. That's when I knew Vane doesn't want money. He wants souls. The truth of her words settled over him like a burial shroud. Tomorrow morning, Martha Patterson would be waiting in her little white farmhouse, unaware that her fate hung in the balance of a broken man's conscience. But as Silas looked at Mercy's face in the moonlight, he realized something that changed everything. The daughter he'd failed to save 20 years ago was gone forever. But this one, this frightened, brave girl who'd cleaned up his ransacked house without being asked, she was still here. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Dawn came too fast and too bright. Silas stood in his yard, saddling his horse while Mercy watched from the porch. She'd been awake when he rose, already dressed, and making coffee like she belonged there. Like she was part of something instead of just a debt that had been paid. "You don't have to do this," she said for the third time. "We could run, both of us, right now." Silas cinched the saddle tight and checked his sidearm. "Run where?" "Vane's got connections from here to El Paso, and Carson made it clear what happens if I don't show up. So you're really going to threaten an old woman?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Silas had been asking himself the same thing all night, and he still didn't have an answer. All he knew was that somewhere in Dustfield, Agnes Holbrook was probably making breakfast for her husband, 20 years after murdering his daughter and getting away with it. "I'm going to Creek Road," he said finally. "What happens there? We'll see." The ride to Martha Patterson's farm took 40 minutes, giving Silas plenty of time to think about all the ways this could go wrong. He could refuse Vane's orders and probably end up dead or framed for Elena's murder. He could intimidate Martha and probably succeed in forcing her off her land, or he could try to find a third option that didn't exist. The Patterson place sat in a small valley surrounded by cotton fields that had seen better days. The house was white clapboard with green shutters, neat as a pin but showing signs of hard times. The barn needed new shingle, and the fence posts were leaning like old men in a windstorm. As Silas approached, the front door opened and a woman emerged. Martha Patterson was smaller than he remembered, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her dress patched but clean. Behind her came a younger man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a lawman's way of standing that made Silas's hand drift toward his gun. "Mr. Thorne," Martha called out, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "This is unexpected. You remember my grandson, Thomas? He's visiting from Denver." Thomas Patterson stepped forward, and Silas could see the badge-shaped tan line on his vest where he usually pinned his star. The man's eyes were sharp and calculating, the kind that missed nothing and forgot less. "Ma'am," Silas touched his hat brim. "Thomas, what brings you out this way?" Thomas asked. His tone was friendly enough, but his hand rested casually near his gun belt. This was the moment, the test Vane had designed. Silas could deliver the message about the debt and the farm, could play his part in the ugly theater of intimidation. Or he could... "Actually came to talk about Cornelius Vane," Silas said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. Martha's face went pale. Thomas's eyes narrowed. "What about him?" "He's coming for this place. Today, probably. Claims your grandmother owes him money, and he wants the farm as payment." "That's ridiculous," Thomas snapped. "Grandma doesn't owe anyone anything." But Martha was already shaking her head, tears forming in her eyes. "The medicine," she whispered. "When your grandfather was dying, I borrowed money for medicine, laudanum for the pain. Vane said it was a loan." "How much?" Thomas demanded. $50, but he says with interest, "It's nearly 200 now." Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. The same trap Elena had fallen into. The same web that had caught Mercy's father. Vane didn't make loans. He made slaves. "There's more," Silas continued. "He sent me here to deliver the message, to make sure you understood the consequences of not paying." Thomas's hand moved to his gun. "Is that a threat?" "No," Silas said quietly. "It's a warning, and probably the last good deed I'll ever do." Because even as he spoke, Silas could see dust clouds rising on the horizon, 3 riders approaching fast, and he recognized Carson's lean silhouette in the lead. Vane hadn't trusted him to do the job alone. Insurance was coming to make sure the message got delivered properly. "Get inside," Silas ordered, dismounting from his horse. "Both of you. And Thomas, you might want to load that gun." Martha grabbed her grandson's arm. "What's happening? What did you do?" Silas looked at the approaching riders, then back at the two people he was supposed to intimidate. People who looked at him with trust instead of fear, even though he'd just admitted to being Vane's hired gun. "What I should have done 20 years ago," he said, drawing his pistol and checking the cylinder. "I'm making a stand." But as Carson and his men rode into the yard with guns already drawn, Silas realized he might have just signed all their death warrants. Carson reined his horse to a stop 20 feet from the porch, his two companions flanking him in a practiced formation. The scar on his face looked even more pronounced in the morning light, and his hand rested easy on his gun like he'd done this dance 100 times before. "Morning, Thorne," Carson called out cheerfully. "Hope you've had a productive conversation with Mrs. Patterson here." Silas kept his gun low but ready. "Conversation's over. You can ride back and tell Vane the message was delivered." "Oh, but that's not quite right, is it?" Carson's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "See, Mr. Vane wanted to make sure there were no misunderstandings about the terms. Sometimes folks need a demonstration of what happens when debts go unpaid." Behind him, Silas heard the front door creak as Martha and Thomas took shelter inside the house. Good. But the walls of that old farmhouse wouldn't stop bullets if this went bad. "The debt's not legitimate," Silas said. $50 for medicine doesn't become 200 just because Vane says so. Carson laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "You're talking about law, Thorne, but out here, Vane is the law. He owns the sheriff, the judge, and half the town council. Who's going to argue with him?" One of Carson's men, a heavy-set fellow with dead eyes, spoke up for the first time. "Enough talk. Let's burn the barn and be done with it." "Now that's the spirit, Dutch," Carson agreed. "Mrs. Patterson needs to understand that resistance has consequences, and our friend Silas here needs to understand what happens when employees don't follow orders." Silas felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. 3 against 1 were bad odds under the best circumstances, and these weren't the best circumstances, not with innocent people caught in the crossfire. "There's another way," Silas said, playing for time. "Let them keep the farm. I'll work for Vane for 2 months instead of 1. Double the time for double the debt." Carson considered this, tilting his head like a curious bird. Generous offer. "But you see, this isn't really about the money anymore. This is about setting an example, about showing folks in Dustfield what happens when they think they can defy Cornelius Vane." The third man had been quiet until now, but Silas noticed he'd been working his way around to the side of the house. Classic flanking maneuver. They weren't here to collect a debt. They were here to make a statement written in blood and ashes. "Besides," Carson continued, "word is you've grown attached to that little blonde dove you rescued yesterday. Shame if something happened to her while you were out here playing hero." The threat hit Silas like a physical blow. They'd left someone watching Mercy. She was alone at his ranch, unprotected, probably thinking he'd be back by noon. But if he didn't return, if he died here trying to protect the Pattersons, "If you're planning to take that girl, you can forget it." Thomas Patterson's voice rang out from the doorway. He stood with his rifle trained on Carson, his lawman's training evident in his stance. "I've sent word to the territorial marshal. He'll be here by evening." Carson's laugh turned genuinely amused. "A bluff, but a good one. Unfortunately, the territorial marshal is 3 days' ride from here, and Dutch gets impatient when he's bored." Dutch was already reaching for something in his saddlebag, probably a torch or coal oil to start the fire. The situation was spiraling toward violence faster than a summer storm. But as Silas watched Carson's confidence, he realized something that changed everything. The man was enjoying this too much, making too many threats, taking too long to get to the point, which meant Vane had given him specific orders about how this needed to play out. And that gave Silas exactly one chance to turn this around. "Tell me something, Carson," Silas said, raising his voice so Thomas could hear inside the house. "Does Vane know you've been skimming money from his collections?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Carson's smile faltered for just a moment, barely a flicker, but Silas caught it. Dutch and the third man exchanged glances, and suddenly the dynamics shifted. That's a serious allegation, Thorne, Carson said carefully. You got proof of that? But Silas was already moving, gambling everything on a bluff born of desperation. Funny thing about working alone on a ranch. Gives a man time to watch things. Like how you told Vane that Williams paid $60 last month when I saw you collect $80. Like how the Morrison debt got marked as uncollectible when Morrison's been dead for 2 years. Carson's hand drifted toward his gun. But Dutch was already looking at him with suspicion. Honor among thieves only went so far when money was involved. You're fishing, Carson said, but his voice had lost its casual confidence. Maybe. Or maybe I've been keeping a ledger, writing down dates, amounts, witnesses. Silas took a step forward. Question is, what's Vane going to do when he finds out his most trusted collector has been stealing from him? The tension in the yard ratcheted up another notch. Dutch's dead eyes were now focused entirely on Carson, and the third man was backing his horse away from the group. Nobody wanted to be caught in the crossfire when thieves started shooting each other. Even if that were true, Carson said slowly, it doesn't change what happens here today. The Patterson farm burns, and you die for disobeying orders. Actually, it changes everything, Thomas Patterson called out from the doorway. Because I've been listening to this whole conversation, and I've got a badge that says I can arrest all 3 of you for conspiracy to commit arson. Carson spun toward the house. You don't have jurisdiction here. Federal crime, federal jurisdiction, Thomas replied calmly, and conspiracy to defraud Mr. Vane's business definitely qualifies. Silas saw his chance and took it. Here's what's going to happen. You 3 are going to ride back to town. Dutch and Miller are going to tell Vane exactly what Carson's been doing. And Carson, well, Carson's got bigger problems than collecting debts now. For a moment, everything balanced on a knife's edge. 4 men with guns, each calculating odds and angles. Then Dutch made the decision for all of them. Carson, you son of a bitch, he growled, drawing his pistol. You've been holding out on us this whole time. The yard exploded into chaos. Carson tried to draw on Dutch while wheeling his horse toward cover. Miller panicked and fired wild, his shot splintering the porch railing near Thomas's head. Dutch's bullet caught Carson in the shoulder, spinning him out of his saddle. Silas put 2 quick shots into Miller's chest, dropping him from his horse like a sack of grain. Thomas's rifle boomed from the doorway, and Dutch clutched his side but kept riding, disappearing over the hill in a cloud of dust and curses. When the gun smoke cleared, Carson lay on his back in the dirt, blood seeping through his shirt. Miller was dead, his horse already wandering toward the barn, and Dutch was gone, probably racing back to Dustfield to tell Vane exactly what had happened. It's not over, Carson gasped, trying to stanch the bleeding with his good hand. Vane will come himself now, and he'll bring an army. Silas knelt beside the wounded man, checking the injury. The bullet had gone clean through, missing anything vital. Carson would live, though he might wish he hadn't when Vane got hold of him. Maybe, Silas said, but now he knows his organization is rotten from the inside. Hard to trust anyone when your own men are stealing from you. Thomas emerged from the house, his rifle still ready. Martha followed, looking shaken but determined. What happens now? She asked. Silas stood and looked toward the horizon where Dustfield lay hidden beyond the hills. Somewhere out there, Mercy was waiting for him to come home. Somewhere out there, Cornelius Vane was probably already planning his revenge. And somewhere out there, Agnes Holbrook was still walking free after 20 years of living with blood on her hands. Now I go back and finish what I started, Silas said, checking his gun and reloading the spent chambers. And you folks pack whatever you can't replace. Because whether we won this fight or not, it's time to leave Texas behind. But as he mounted his horse and prepared to ride back to whatever waited for him in Dustfield, Silas realized something had changed inside him. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't running from his past. He was riding toward something that might finally be worth the fight. If you're enjoying this story of redemption and sacrifice in the Old West, hit that subscribe button because we've got more tales of courage and justice coming your way. The ride back to his ranch would be the longest of Silas Thorne's life, and when he arrived, he would discover that saving Mercy Whitlock was only the beginning of a reckoning that had been 20 years in the making. Silas rode hard toward his ranch, Carson's words echoing in his mind. If Vane had sent men to watch Mercy, she could already be gone by the time he arrived. The thought drove him faster, pushing his horse beyond safe limits across the rough terrain. But as he crested the final hill, relief flooded through him. Mercy stood on his porch, very much alive and pointing his own rifle at 3 men who sat with their hands raised in obvious surrender. Even from a distance, he could see bodies on the ground near the barn. "Mercy!" he called out as he approached. "About time you got back," she replied without lowering the rifle. "These gentlemen came calling about an hour ago. Said they had business with you." Silas dismounted and saw the situation clearly. 2 of Vane's men lay dead near the water trough, and a third sat wounded against the porch steps. Mercy had somehow managed to turn the tables on trained killers. How was all Silas could manage. "Daddy might have been weak with cards and whiskey," Mercy said with a grim smile, "but he taught me to shoot straight. These boys didn't expect much resistance from a poor little dove." The wounded man, barely more than a kid, looked up at Silas with frightened eyes. "Mr. Vane's coming," he stammered. "Bringing everyone. Said to tell you this ends tonight." Silas felt the familiar weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. Vane would come with overwhelming force, probably burning everything in his path. There would be no more running, no more compromises. This was the moment that would define the rest of their lives. "Pack what you can carry," he told Mercy. "We're leaving." "Running won't solve this," she replied, finally lowering the rifle. "Vane will just find other people to hurt. Other girls to put in cages." She was right, and Silas knew it. But the alternative was a war they couldn't win against an enemy with unlimited resources and no conscience. Then, from the direction of town, they heard it, the thunder of approaching horses. Too many horses. Vane was coming, and he was bringing an army. "Get inside," Silas ordered, but Mercy shook her head. "I'm done hiding," she said firmly. "If this is where we make our stand, then this is where we make it together." As the riders came into view, Silas counted at least 15 men. Vane himself rode in the center, his expensive suit incongruous among the dust and violence of his hired killers. But something else caught Silas's attention. A smaller group approaching from the east, Thomas Patterson and 5 other men, all wearing badges and carrying rifles. The territorial marshal had arrived early, and he'd brought deputies. The 2 groups converged on Silas's ranch like opposing storm fronts. Vane's army pulled up in a semicircle, their weapons drawn but uncertain. The lawmen formed a line between them and the house, their authority clear even when outnumbered. "Cornelius Vane," the marshal called out, his voice carrying across the yard, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, and operating an illegal debt collection scheme." Vane's laugh was bitter. "On whose authority? I own this county." "Federal authority," Thomas Patterson answered, stepping forward with his rifle ready, "and federal law trumps local corruption." For a moment, everything hung in perfect balance. Then Vane made his choice. "Kill them all!" he snarled. The gunfight that followed was brief, but devastating. Vane's men, caught between the house and the lawmen, found themselves in a crossfire with no cover. The marshal's deputies were professionals who shot to kill, not intimidate. Within minutes, half of Vane's army lay dead or wounded in the dust. Vane himself took a bullet in the chest from Thomas Patterson's rifle as he tried to flee. He fell from his horse and crawled behind a water trough, blood foaming on his lips. Silas found him there as the shooting died down, gasping like a landed fish. The man who had controlled Dustfield through fear and debt was dying badly, alone and abandoned by the men he'd bought. "Should have taken the deal," Vane wheezed. "Could have owned you." "Maybe," Silas replied, kneeling beside the dying man, "but some things aren't for sale." Vane's eyes went glassy, and he died with his expensive boots in the Texas dirt, surrounded by the wreckage of his criminal empire. The cleanup took hours, bodies to bury, statements to give, evidence to catalog. But as the sun set over the ranch, Silas found himself sitting on his porch with Mercy, watching the last of the lawmen ride away. "It's over," she said quietly. "This part is," Silas agreed, "but there's still one thing left to do." The next morning, they rode into Dustfield together. Silas went straight to the sheriff's office, where the marshal was still processing prisoners and sorting through Vane's records. Agnes Holbrook sat in one of the cells, finally arrested for the murders she'd committed 20 years ago. Vane's ledgers had contained detailed records of every crime he'd used for blackmail, including the poison deaths of Elena and Isabella Vasquez. "She confessed this morning," the marshal told Silas. "Said she was tired of carrying the guilt. Said watching what happened to you and the girl made her realize some debts have to be paid." Silas looked through the bars at the woman who had stolen his daughter's life. She looked smaller than he remembered, broken by decades of living with murder on her conscience. He waited for the satisfaction of justice, the feeling of vindication he'd imagined for 20 years. Instead, he felt only emptiness. Elena and Isabella were still dead. Agnes Holbrook's punishment wouldn't bring them back or erase the years of guilt he'd carried. "What now?" Mercy asked as they walked out into the sunlight. Silas looked at the girl who had changed everything, who had given him a reason to fight instead of just survive. "Now we build something new, somewhere far from here, where the past can't follow us." They left Dustfield that afternoon with their few possessions and a wagon full of hope. But more importantly, they left together, no longer a broken man and a rescued girl, but two people who had found something worth fighting for in each other. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, but for the first time in 20 years, Silas Thorne was riding toward something instead of away from it. And beside him, Mercy Whitlock smiled at the horizon like she could see all the way to tomorrow. 3 years later, Silas and Mercy owned a small but prosperous farm in Colorado Territory. They married the following spring in a ceremony witnessed by Thomas Patterson and his grandmother Martha. Mercy gave birth to twin daughters who inherited their father's determination and their mother's courage. The past finally became just that, past, buried beneath the weight of a life worth living.